Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time, which, as I'm sure those of you listening to this show for a while now know, means reevaluating where we are in the accepted cultural narratives that we have internalized, narratives of our origins and our destiny. Seeing things in a new way transforms our understanding of past, present, and future, which is why I am committed to exploring the margins of our maps and indulging alternative perspectives on all of those things we take for granted. One great example is today's guest, Bernie Taylor, someone I imagine history may redeem as one of those almost cliche outsiders who managed to precipitate a total revolution in a field beyond their supposed expertise. Bernie's work with ancient cave artwork dispels our presentist interpretations of the meaning of these most ancient forms of human cultural activity, and it recasts our understanding of the prehistoric roots of contemporary and ubiquitous forms, the hero's journey, the annual round, the relationship between the human and the non-human. It was really exciting to talk to him last fall, and I'm glad that I finally have the bandwidth to get this episode out for you. But before we begin, I'd like to give a deep thanks to the 145 Patreon supporters that are helping me keep this show and all of the surrounding creative activity, the free and public Facebook group, all of the new music and art, and the Future Fossils Psychedelic Science Fiction Book Club, all of these things, including our newest patrons, Kate O, Jason Krapf, Stephen Scully, Charlie Pateski, and Miriam and Tyler Kimbrough. Thank you all so much for joining the Future Fossils community, and I hope that you're all making the most that you can of all of the exclusive and early release stuff that goes in there. Heads up to anyone who's been on the fence about contributing to my annual goal of reaching 200 Patreon supporters. Our next book club meeting will be on the monolithic masterpiece of Chinese science fiction, Cixin Liu's Three-Body Problem, and I'll be putting up a scheduling poll for that 2-hour video called Discussion on Patreon here shortly. Also, a big thanks to everyone who has been reviewing this show on Apple Podcasts. There are now 123 ratings and just a long scroll of gushing 5-star reviews, which, as I'm sure anyone listening to podcasts on a regular basis knows, makes an enormous difference to the discoverability of this show, its longevity, and the richness of its community. As we continue to involve more and more people in the conversation and serve more and more minds with these inspiring discussions, it makes a huge difference if you want to just pop on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to be listening to this and take a moment to leave a short review. Deeply appreciated, and it helps folks sift through the avalanche of new information and decide to join you in the warm and welcoming waters of this show. So thanks again to everybody who's been leading the charge on that front, and to everyone who will in the days and weeks to come. And with that, let me express my deep appreciation for Bernie Taylor as a bizarrely rare archaeological voice on this supposedly archaeological program. The last episode I think I had with someone studying cave art phenomena was with Dr. Chill back in episode 13. So definitely check that one out after you've listened to this if you've enjoyed this conversation. Both of them are fascinating and both offer a very compelling window into the early minds of humanity. So enjoy. Thanks a lot. And I'll see you again next week. All right, Bernie Taylor, it's a pleasure to have you on Future Fossils.
Michael, thanks for having me.
So I can relate to the somewhat difficult condition of being an independent scholar.
hmm
And although I don't want to take up too much of this conversation talking about that, I am curious how you came into your archaeological study outside of institutional affiliation, and a bit of history and background about your passion for this stuff, and leading into the actual meat of your thesis would be a great place to start, I think.
Absolutely. So I stumbled into this from other places. And how this journey sort of started was I wrote a book about trout. Okay. And that book evolved into some work about biological clocks and rhythms in nature. Then I wrote another book about titled Biological Time. And in biological time, I looked at a wide range of animals across the biological spectrum, including salmon. And I gave presentations at universities, Fish and Wildlife agencies, the tribes, academic conferences, all that sort of stuff. Did the peer-reviewed literature as well. And what I found is that if people have a good idea, or at least an idea that doesn't harm anybody, they're generally receptive. But it takes some time to change the mode. And the thesis of the biological time book went down to a very simple concept, is that there are many animals that have lunar timing, so they're timed to light and dark cycles of the night. Well, the moon is out of sync with the year, and so if you take 12 times 29 and a half, you're 11 days short of 365. So if the migration of the salmon, hypothetically, is during the dark period of the moon, then it would be January 12th one year and January 1st the next year. And that's why the migrations of salmon are earlier or later from one year to the next. Okay. And so I applied that principle across the biological spectrum, gave lots of presentations, and I also interrelated with the tribes here in the Columbia Basin of Oregon. And when you start connecting with Indians, you hear things that you've never read in school. And they had this whole thing in their calendars. And they had it in their artwork and in their traditions and how they hunted and fished and gathered and their holidays and everything else. And someone said to me, if the Indians have it, maybe people have it deeper in time. So in biological time, I looked back into the Lascaux Cave 17,000 years ago, and I found the connection between these biological clocks and rhythms as Native Americans practice them, and as is biologically, statistically demonstrated, that it was also in the caves in France. And I left it there in terms of the archaeology. Then I said to myself, I'm going to come back 10 years and start this process over again. And it came back 10 years, and by that time, older caves that were older, or at least the art was older, had emerged in their own dating. And I can go back to 40,000 years ago, the El Castillo cave, and I started counting the dots, biological time stuff with the animals, same as I did in the book. And I found that, well, there's more to the story here. And right away I started seeing animals in El Castillo cave in the Cantabria region, and they're African animals. And it sort of set me off on a different path of the biological time of the plants, the animals, and how do they know where to harvest and hunt and gather, all that sort of stuff. And so a scholar outside the system was actually helpful, because I didn't have to follow any rules. I could talk to anthropologists and archaeologists and people who study different areas without being stuck in any particular box. But then again, I also pushed some buttons as well, because millions of people had seen these images but didn't see these animals. And there's reasons why they didn't see them, and it has to do with the psychology of man and how the cave artists hid them as part of a test. But I had a kind of a lucky break on this. And I had met someone in my early 20s, I'm 53 now. His name is George Schaller. And George Schaller is considered the world's foremost wildlife biologist. He was the mentor of Jane Goodall and everybody at that time period you could possibly imagine. And I connected with George briefly, 20 minutes when I was in Beijing in my 20s. And I reconnected with him when I was starting on this project, because I found these African animals. I wanted to see if George could say if they were what I believed to be African animals. And I wanted to see if George would agree or not. And he agreed to, take a quick look. Well, a year and a half later and hundreds of emails, quick looks later, we kind of had a rapport, and we came to a common mind that, yes, in fact, the animals on one end of this 10-meter panel, which is about 30 feet, were African animals, and the animals on the other end of this panel were European animals. And the animals in between were marine animals. And so we have somebody who traveled from the Iberian Peninsula, now Spain, across the Strait of Gibraltar to Africa and then back again. And so in a nutshell of how does a scholar work from the outside to, and I don't see myself as a scholar, I see more as a naturalist, how does someone work from the outside and integrate to mainstream science in these different fields is to, get people's attention and people who are interested in pursuing interesting directions. And in this case, I really got George's interest because he was like, we were finding animals he never envisioned. We found a cheetah and 4 cubs. We found Iberian lynx, and the juvenile is pushing up against the ruff of the chin of the mother. It's a touching scene. We have a lioness who's licking up to a lion. She's licking his mouth as greeting him. And so we found all these amazing scenes that George related to as a wildlife biologist.
Let's stop there and unpack that a little bit for people, because you're talking
Sure.
about, you talked about counting dots, and you're talking about the red ochre dots.
Yes.
Castillo, right? This was, if people can go to beforeorion.com and see your pictures and your interpretations of this stuff.
Sure.
I also saw a more kind of mainstream take on El Castillo on the Netflix series Civilization.
Yes.
Recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so they didn't see it.
Yeah, they didn't see it. And so you see in the show, you see the dots, but you don't see the creatures. And like watching
Correct.
your videos on YouTube, I was struck by, there was another fellow, an amateur archaeologist in Austin, Texas, whose private collection of stone tools I was given a tour of a while back. And he was pointing out all of these, what he saw as faces in these stones, and basically making this case that we projected life, that we saw life and character and personality and all of this stuff back then, and that it's, in a sense, it's like not a surprise that the first time we recognize animal artwork in the human archaeological record, it's like fully developed. It's those like gorgeous, realistic Lascaux, horses and stuff. But you would expect there to be this other kind of more alien or more bizarre relationship to nature, and that's what you're pointing to, right? So like how are you actually identifying this stuff? How did you come to see it in the first place? Like what's going on there?
That's a really good question. This is the El Castillo cave and the gallery of discs. How did I get beyond the red discs? Okay, really what it was, and what the people in the Netflix Civilization program didn't do, is I was looking for a horse. Okay, in the Paleolithic record, the most common animal depicted is a horse, and typically a pregnant mare. So we've got this 10-meter panel with dots streaming across the middle, and each dot is about the size of the palm of your hand. There's maybe 80 or 90 in total. And I said, there's a lot of space on that panel. So I started looking for the horse, and I didn't find it till 3 years later. And it ended up being the most important animal to have found to put the pieces together. But before I found the horse, we found all these other animals. And the most significant one, which is really the showstopper, and it was the giraffe. There were no, because you can argue with they were different animals in Europe and Africa at the same time, but there were no giraffes in Europe during anywhere near that time period. And when I remember that I saw it, and it's a fabulous giraffe because it's life size. It's a 10-meter panel, and this giraffe covers about a third of it. And the red discs form the molted pattern on the neck of the giraffe. And it has the ears and the horns and so on. And I zipped it off to George in the email, said, I found a giraffe. And before he gets back to me, responds back to me minutes later, I said, oh my God, I see another giraffe. And there's a juvenile which wraps its neck around the mother. And the juvenile's head tucks in under the chin of the mother. And this was, again, you have a mother giraffe protecting her young. We have this beautiful empathetic scene, which George kept bringing out to me. It's not about counting the discs. It's not about the biology. It's about these artists understood the feelings of these animals and could relate to them. And that was really the message I got from George, as in addition to the taxonomy and actually identifying these animals. And so that was the moment. That was George's moment and my moment that we just had it, because it was the giraffe. Because there's lions in the panel. We could have been lions of both sides. There's cheetah. You could have had cheetah in Europe at that time. We have no evidence of it, but there could have been cheetah and bears and so forth. But it was the giraffe that made the difference. And we also, what was so important about this giraffe, it had very distinct features of a giraffe. And so this isn't like a globular type of thing a first grader does. This is a very detailed taxonomic representation. This artist had been to Africa. He had seen a giraffe, and he had seen the relationship between the mother and the young. Or he copied a picture of somebody else who did it. So maybe someone chalked on the back of a fur or something, of a tanned hide, but someone had seen a giraffe. Because it's nothing you could have seen in the European environment that you could have related to. It was so far off. So that was the big moment. And when people see when I do presentations and so forth, and people, maybe it's Europe, but everybody, when they see the giraffe, they just say, okay, that's what it is. And what's most important about this giraffe is it becomes the first evidence, other than DNA, that we had traveled from Africa to Europe, and we had traveled back again. And so this whole idea that people took, tens of thousands of years to migrate around the Mediterranean before they got in Europe is nonsensical. People swim across the Strait of Gibraltar today. It takes about 3 hours. Some people have done it 3 lengths in a kind of a race. And you catch these currents that go in and out of the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and you catch them one way, and then you catch them the other way to kind of swing back towards Africa. People were doing it. They knew how to swim. We can see a person swimming this image. And it changes the whole human migration story, in that people just didn't leave Africa. They left Africa, and then they came back again. They traveled back for what I would describe as the hero's journey experience, which is more, we know for the work of Joseph Campbell and Young.
So these animals in the rock, they're not painted in, like they're decorated in the ochre dots, right? But you're actually,
yes, yeah,
they're like a part of the cave. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, absolutely. So you can imagine you've walked down rivers, alongside rivers, and you've seen stone walls. And some of the rivers you've walked down are like limestone. If you like Pennsylvania, you'll see limestone walls along the rivers. So you have this huge limestone wall that has some organic matter, has some mineral matter across the top. That mineral matter was on the whole panel at one time. So the first thing the artist does is he starts scraping off that mineral matter, and he creates white spaces. About 2/3 from the floor going up towards the ceiling. But he keeps the top in that darker mineral matter, and he carves out images of animals in that darker matter. And then what he does, he carves out images of animals in this white limestone, or off-white limestone at this point. And then he puts the red discs on top. He puts the red discs on top, and there's also some black discs, and he does some shading with black as well. But there's also blue paint. There's a man that wears a mask, and it's painted. It's actually painted blue. Someone brought blue from outside and put it on to create this man's mask, and his blue eyes.
What is the pigment? The blue pigment.
So good question. So now is the time for the archaeologists to go figure that one out. And the people who are responsible for these caves they see it, they get what's going on, and they're now doing what they do as archaeologists to figure out what makes the pigment. And George was interesting. When he first saw it, he said, did someone bring a bucket of paint in there? Because I was thinking it was actually the original rock, but in fact it is some sort of blue paint, most likely some sort of marine matter. But it's there. So the artist used many different techniques to bring out natural formations in the rocks to form the animals, to engrave animals on top of each other. So we have, and people on top of animals. So, for example, a man overlaps with a horse and he becomes a centaur. The same man overlaps with an eagle and he becomes an avianoid, a birdman. Another man overlaps with a dolphin to become a merman. And the artist does this throughout the whole process. And what he's doing with this is when the hero on his journey encounters these animals, he draws strength from them. And that's how it typically is in the shamanic journey, some shamanic hero's journey, is that the indigenous people drew strength from the animals. But what's most interesting about the animals they draw strength from, they're almost all female. So what does that say? So the male hero draws strength from the female characters. Is it matriarchal or patriarchal? What do you think?
Well, that's interesting because I was just listening to, I've had culture critic John David Ebert on the show. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his stuff, but he was just giving a talk in Santa Fe last night that I attended. And he was talking about the use of red ochre in basically demarcating human burial rites, and like these, when like Neanderthals, even before that, started these like collective graves and these keyhole shaped deals that was, we believe, kind of an indication of the the maternal vulva, like the great mother, and that the red ochre would have been the the menstrual blood of the mother goddess. And so it doesn't really surprise me at all that if we go this far back, that we would see that particular power emphasized in this, that there is that piece of it. The other thing that I think about hearing this, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I just listened to a great episode of the Stuff to Blow Your Mind podcast that they put out for Halloween, specifically about the history of the monster. And they kind of framed the whole thing in the conversation of the sculpture of the Lowenmensch from Germany, the lion-headed and possibly also lion-footed figurine that clearly took like hundreds of hours to carve.
Sure.
And this, puzzling around this particular issue of, this being a sort of prototypical or archetypical instance of these combinations, much like we see later on with like the sorcerer, the sort of like half man, half deer. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is actually that we've sort of mistaken these human animal hybrids in three-dimensional sculptural form, that they may actually be like referencing these sort of superpositions of human and animal in the cave art, where you actually see in 2D, you'll see multiple relatively clearly rendered images actually just stacked right on top of each other. Right.
Absolutely. So you're making a really good point. Okay. Well, back to the mother goddess thing with the red. I would just describe the red as describing sacred space versus you could, from sacred space, you can bring it in many different directions, but with the person you had on.
Yeah.
But back to, let's call them the monsters, right? So why do monsters live in caves, which is an archetypal symbol that's in our head? Well, if I just saw the man that overlaps with the horse, I would, it's a monster, right? It's the man integrated with the two. But then as we see these characters going across the panel with the people overlapping with the animals, and we can see that he runs with the strength of the mare. He swims with the strength of the dolphin. He flies with with the fortitude of the eagle. And so we by seeing these interrelationship in the actual story, we can just see that they're not monsters per se. But so this is where it gets really important. We actually know the story. This is the story that the Greeks told us. It's the story of Hercules. So on this panel, we have a man at one end to the north and a man to the south. The man to the north is the constellation Hercules. That horse I mentioned is Pegasus. The eagle is Aegea. The dolphin is Pisces. We have Orion, And then we have above him, I said the lions. Well, the lions would become Leo. And next to Leo, we have the bears, Ursa Major. We have the great auk, which is Cygnus. And we have a lion, a crocodile, which becomes Draco. And there's many other constellations in there as well. So the ancients had been to these caves, and they'd been to this cave specifically because there's very specific images that they drew out from them. And their interpretation of this was that Hercules goes on a journey, and he interrelates with all these characters. And so Hercules and Orion are the same character in the Paleolithic story, but the Greeks separated them. So but the Greeks didn't really understand. They took them as kind of not really monsters, but definitely not the interrelationship between the male character borrowing the strength of the female. We went to some different, I don't want to say awakening, but a different way of thinking, that the animals, we could draw strength from them, but they didn't have to be male animals. But it was still the males who, we have the centaurs of males, as far as I've seen. But,
I wonder about this because I know, again, my sort of intersection with archaeology is somewhat limited, but I've heard from a number of different people, talking about this sort of history of the zodiac, right? Basically, is what you're pointing to, and you're saying that this El Castillo cave mural was capturing both what I guess we could take to be some sort of initiatory rite, like a crossing of the Strait of Gibraltar, and a kind of like a field expedition, like go find these animals and probably like ritually engage in some way, or like like at least identify them, like the birder kind of thing, witness them with your own eyes, perhaps. But then that would be like a microcosm of the precession of the equinoxes, right? Like, Bill Thompson talks about a lot of this early cave art pointing to like the age before the age of Pisces.
Yeah, so I don't agree with that. Yeah, so I don't agree. So I don't agree. I don't believe that they monitored the precession of the equinoxes, or that it's depicted in the Paleolithic cave art. And this is the reason why. I'm going to start is that this image depicts a early June time period. Okay, so we're near to the summer solstice. And how we can tell that is two ways. One is we can look at the animals, and that's in the time of their life history strategy, it's early June, early to mid-June. Okay. And the second way we can tell is that through the astronomy is I can dial back the clock in the astronomy programs to 34,000 years ago, and this is a pre-dawn time scene in looking from the Strait of Gibraltar. Okay, so we can actually see the night sky that we can see now. The computer program is exactly the same as they saw it. As the computer program mathematically puts it back in time when some of the stars change and all that sort of stuff. So the concept of this precession of the equinox is that people are timing back. It isn't correct. What the Greeks did and the other ancients did is they started this concept of the precession of the equinox. But they couldn't tell 34,000 years ago. They could have told it was a June time period, but they could not have told that. They could have gauged that it was 34,000 years ago based on the astronomy, because the stars move up and below the horizon, and they didn't have that knowledge. Ptolemy, who's considered the let's call him the first astronomer among the Greeks, the major astronomer, so roughly just over 2,000 years ago. He was also the librarian at the Alexandria. Ptolemy gave us the astronomical record that we have today. So most of the major constellations in the Northern Hemisphere came from Ptolemy. Ptolemy borrowed them from this image, or he had a reference that borrowed it from this image. And there have been many questions about Ptolemy over time. He said, well, how could he have known about these constellations? Because some of the constellations of Ptolemy's record were too far south that he could have seen them, or other Greeks could have seen them. And so what it was is that because the so-called precession of the equinoxes, the globe spins like a top. But it's not really about the equinox. It's about the spinning like a top. And when it spins down, you can see some stars. Fewer stars. When it spins up, you can see more stars. And so Ptolemy couldn't have seen the stars that he put in his record. So where did he get them from? He got them from the time period. And I would argue it was actually this cave. So he's because all his constellation, most of his constellations, we can see them here intact in their form. But the precession of the equinox concept that people were looking to images to try to go back in time, it doesn't work. But it was a good idea. It was a great area for exploration, but everybody wasn't working off the equinoxes. And that's really the fundamental problem with this. People are different. People made cave art or astronomical interpretations into the caves throughout the world. And they did it different times of the year based on where they were hunting and gathering. But this whole precession of the equinox thing with the zodiac is fundamentally based around the equinoxes and the vernal equinox. The zodiac, as we know it, wasn't created until the Babylonians. These ancients didn't have a zodiac. The Paleolithic cave artists didn't have a zodiac. They used constellations that the Babylonians and Greeks later became the zodiac, which is a big difference. But it is the root. It is the roots of the whole thing. But it's not the. They didn't have. I don't believe. There's no indication that they were in the precession of the equinoxes because they weren't even working on the equinoxes.
Mm. You mentioned something also about the counting of the dots.
Yeah.
And that in your relation to this establishing a lunar time, were you saying that there was a identifying markers of a lunar calendar in this hero's journey, like in this mural?
Yeah. So that's where I started,
Mm-hmm.
and where it ended up is to throw up the numbers out the window. And in the previous book, in Lascaux, there's lots of nomenclature that tie specifically to the lunar timing of the animals and their biological events. It's pretty simple. But this is further back in time. I don't believe they did it that way. What they did was they had the very specific taxonomic details of the animals for that time of year. For example, there's a juvenile golden eagle, which is fledging. And so you can see it's white down. And it tells us that it's so many days or so many weeks from the time that the egg hatched. And we can figure out what time the eggs hatched for a golden eagle in that part of the world. And we can figure out the timing to be early June. But so they were more interested in they were depicting very specific time periods of the animals. And I said there's a lynx, a mother lynx and her kitten. Well, there's only one kitten and there should be two. Well, the kittens get killed off pretty quick. The lynx kittens, usually by the other kitten. There's also a bunch of there's a cheetah with her young. There's four to five young. There's definitely, we can see four juveniles. Maybe there's a fifth. Well, cheetah kittens get killed off pretty quick too, and that would tell us that it was within 2 months of the cheetahs being born that this was depicted. Any further than that, you're down to 2 or 3 kittens. And so the artist, as I see it, he depicted the very specific time periods of the animals. And I actually left the counting of the discs because I realized that the red discs on this panel were a test to see if the apprentice who can get past see the forest through the trees, or in this case to see the elephants and the giraffes and all these other animals without getting tied up with the red discs. And I've given this test to many people who had no idea what I was doing. It was before the book came out. And I could pretty much tell, you actually, there's a correlation between what people do for a living and what they look for. So people who have engineering, we'll call it mathematical science degrees, they start counting the red discs. Whereas people that have more of an art background or social scientists, they start looking in the lines. They start seeing what the possibilities are. And so there's a mindset that I believe that this was testing for, and a mindset that was important for the apprentice who would become the shamanic teacher and carry on the traditions of their people. So I believe it was about the red discs, about seeing the forest through trees and getting past the red discs to see the beauty of the world and all the possibilities.
Yeah, there's something about the recognizing the figure in the negative space, right?
Yes.
That we talk about, like Temple Grandin talks about the autistic mindset as thinking in images rather than in words. Mm-hmm. And there's evidence that different cultures, like the American culture, will look at the same image as Japanese culture of a group of people, and the person standing in the front of the group is wearing a different expression than everyone else. And Americans tend to believe that this person is this protagonist is in the right, whereas the Japanese, they've found, tend to believe that this person is somehow like putting on a false front in like representing a group in a diplomatic way. So, I mean, it sounds to me like you're pointing to, first of all, an emphasis, and your YouTube videos say as much, that there's an emphasis here on the appreciation of neurodiversity.
Correct.
But can you speak more to that? And like,
let me do that. That's important. Yeah. And there was a paper written last spring or published last spring that they believe that the people who made the cave art were autistic, because some autistic people pass what's called an embedded image test, and many of these images are embedded. Okay, you have taken embedded image tests in your life. Remember when you were younger, you went to a diner, and on the flip side of the kids' menu, there are like animals that were embedded in like a forest, and you had to find the animals.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's an embedded image test. But when psychologists give it, they don't do animals that have shapes. Okay, and this is fun in that this panel is an embedded image test, just like the one you did on the flip side of your kids' menu when you were a child. So the question is, what kind of people more easily pass this embedded image test? It said that people have local processing bias versus global processing bias, which sees kind of a bigger picture of stuff. So the question is, do I, Bernie Taylor, am I autistic? No. But how can I do very well with this embedded image test that millions of other people hadn't seen? So I'm dyslexic, and that means that I see in pictures. I don't see in words. So I don't think in words, I should say. And so through my whole life, I've been, I struggle with writing, but I'm an accomplished writer, obviously, by this point. I've worked very hard at it. But I'm a visual person. So I was like the perfect person to look at this. And I believe with this test was a picture thinker. And so dyslexia, autism, Asperger's, they're different neurological differences in the mind. They're not deficiencies. They're not hardships. They're just different ways of seeing things. And I believe that this test was for a person who could see the world differently and see differently from the tribe, because this person was so important. This apprentice would become the spiritual leader who told the time, told the stories, kept the traditions. Because when these people, for example, a salmon or a trout run was coming up the river, if they were late, they didn't have food. If they're too early for a migration of the bison or the reindeer, they didn't have food. So this person had to be working outside the realms of normal thinking of, counting peanuts, making baskets, and drying food. This person had to be on the periphery, had to be kind of like the big thinker, had to be the Elon Musk of the tribe, of the clan. And I believe that this test was to bring that story. Someone could do it. And by the way, when I gave people this test, I had a wide spectrum. And some people, they struggled to see the elephant, and they kept going back to the red disc. But there was actually two people that looked at this gallery, this panel, and everything that I see now that took me 3 years to see it, just jumped out at those people at one time. It was actually fascinating to see this. So we truly are wired differently. And at the boardroom table, in whatever conference we're in, if you choose people that are all wired the same way, you're not going to get the greater perspective. If you study Paleolithic cave art with people who, very intelligent people, hardworking people that are really good at digging up the ground and looking at counting grains of sand, that's not going to be the person who has the ability to pull out these images from the wall.
So you don't think that this was a common rite of passage for... Oh,
I think it was. Totally. I think that most of the cave images in Europe were a rite of passage, because actually not most of the images, that there was a panel in each cave that was a rite of passage. There was one panel that was a test. Other ones I can't say one way or the other. but for sure there was always one panel, and it's typically in the deeper part of the caves, and that's where I found these. And this is, I did, I had a few panels in the book that I pulled out the images that had not been previously identified, but there's others too that I didn't do because I didn't have rights, I couldn't get rights to the images, but I paid for the rights to the ones I used for the book, so I can make t-shirts if I want to. But absolutely, there was at least one panel that was a rite of passage test for the apprentice to see if they could see the forest through the trees. I reasoned that there could be more in there, but I've encountered people that, I mean, it just jumps out at them. So we are truly wired differently.
So there's the image recognition test. Like, if you can read this t-shirt, you might be a shaman. But then there's also, you talk about the crossing of the water, the crossing of Gibraltar Strait. And
yes.
do you believe that that was a commonly held activity, or do you believe that that was reserved for the people who passed the image recognition test, I guess is what I'm asking.
I think there are many levels of the test.
Yeah.
There are many levels of the test, okay. The first level of the test was you had to be able to see the forest through the trees. And by seeing the forest through the trees, you could actually see the map. And so we have all these animals that are from Europe and they're from Africa and, of course, the marine environment in the middle. And those same animals are the same as the constellations in the night sky. So as this hero takes his journey through down the Iberian Peninsula, across the strait, he's charting his progress in the night sky and through the animals around him. So there's many steps in the test that one passes, and at how Native Americans told stories like this is that when they encountered animals, they learned from those animals. So the animals who weren't what they hunted just for food, is that in fact if the animal, they did kill the animal, they had a blessing for the animal and an offering, and they recognized that the animal gave something of themselves to set the Native American, give them a meal. So this shamanic apprentice, he takes this journey, and he travels by the earth and again in the night sky as his map, and he encounters all these animals and he learns from them. He learns that the mother protects the young, and this is revolutionary in the concept of archaeology, because not just archaeology, anthropology, sociology, psychology, how modern man thinks is based on the Epic of Gilgamesh, dug up in the sands of the Middle East about 4,500 years ago. And Gilgamesh is a story of a man who goes on a journey, and he fundamentally has all the same issues that we have today, okay? And the people in his environment have the same issues. And so psychologists will start there and say, okay, so Gilgamesh is basically, just as nuts as we are, therefore we haven't changed that much in 4,500 years. Well, this now puts it back 30,000 years beyond that. We haven't changed. So in this program, we talk about future fossils. We today are, a carbon copy of what people were doing 34,000 years ago. And I would be willing to bet that it's hundreds of thousands of years ago before that we haven't changed very much. So, it's like we're like Batman. We have better toys, okay? But we still have that animus spirit within us that ties us to the world around us.
That's interesting, because Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University has done a lot of work on the reappearance of the superhero in modern culture, and draws a straight line back to exactly this kind of human-animal superposition, and the acquisition, like Spider-Man being sort of the ultimate example of someone who's, he's like bitten by the spider. And so it's like, in a way, it's like his, he makes this blood offering to a traditionally female animal in its mythological tellings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like through that he gains all these things, and that it's the empowerment of the individual through the relaxation of the human animal boundary. So like what other?
That's brilliant, by the way. That's brilliant. He's right on with that. It's brilliant.
So what are the other characteristics? I mean, I know that one of your videos in particular addresses the crossing of the Great Water, and I'd love to hear you riff on that, obviously, because we've been talking about the actual swimming across the Strait of Gibraltar, and how that shows up, how that particular piece of this has like been carried down through the ages.
Absolutely,
what
that's
you
great.
think that meant to them in a kind of a more spiritual sense?
Well, the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung found that the two most common non-organic symbols in dreams were the mountain and the body of water. And there's a really great song by Billy Joel, "The River of Dreams." Can you sing it for us?
It's been so long.
Okay. So Billy Joel wakes up in the night with a song in his head, and it's the River of Dreams. And in this dream, he goes down to the river, but the river's too wide and too far to cross. But he wants to cross to the other. He's seeking to cross to the other side, and he also encounters the mountains of faith. Now, Billy Joel is and was a secular piano man. Okay, he was not a spiritual man, and he struggled with this song because it's portraying a spiritual theme that he just wasn't comfortable with. And so he's in the shower, and it's still bouncing around his head, and he puts it down to print and says, "I'm going with this." And it became one of the most famous, popular songs. And so Billy Joel has these archetypal characters in his head, the mountains and the body of water. And the water is the water of transformation. Jesus is baptized in the River Jordan by Saint John. In this particular water, when he swims across that water, he's swimming to almost certain death. Okay, and it's the transformation between the world that he knows to a world beyond his imagination, where there's the giraffe and there's the crocodiles and all these other lions and so forth. And so it's the water transformation. It's the water of no return. And we find that throughout the mythological literature, that they cross this water of transformation. It's a common theme. If you were to research how to write a novel, in it, which they'd have things like the archetypal river of transformation and the cosmic mountain and many others. So they're somehow within our psyche. Now, Jung said that there's too many people that had these archetypes, that it was so uncanny, and people that didn't relate to each other, and people hadn't read about the mythology of crossing the rivers. So how did they have it in their dreams? And from that, he postulated the idea of this collective unconscious, that we somehow carry symbols within ourselves in addition to, of course, instinctual behavior. And so that's where Jung came about, this collective unconscious. And it was through the dreams of man. Jung had a record of many thousands of dreams where he had these archetypal symbols. And not just the inorganic ones, but he had horse, he had elephant, and dark birds, and a few others. But it's in us. And that's what really bothered Billy Joel, is he recognized he had this spiritual song in his head about crossing the river of transformation, of the river of death, to go to the other side, and he didn't want to write it down. And I saw an interview from Billy on YouTube that was done many years later, and he talks about the song. He says, I really never understood what it was about. Well, I'm going to tell you, Billy Joel has never been to a psychologist, because it's like the first chapter of 101, okay? Is this the river of transformation? But Billy he wasn't connected in that way, but he wasn't intellectually connected that way, but he was spiritually or psychologically connected, that he carried this song with us that we still can't shake. And it doesn't have to be the river per se. For example, when Luke Skywalker, he travels from his home place to another planet, deep space is the biggest river of all. And in this gallery, this image, we have the constellations. In the area between where we find the Iberian Peninsula, when we have Africa, we have the body of water, the marine environment, we have these marine animals. Well, in the night sky, that's also called the sea. And that's why I have all the marine animals. And so in this archetypal journey that Billy Joel takes, and that Hercules takes, because he takes the journey across the Strait of Gibraltar. And then, as we see depicted in this image, it's the greatest journey of all through space, which is, as we would believe, not just the river, but to the hereafter. And many Native Americans, they traveled across, they depicted themselves in images and stories as traveling in a canoe across the Milky Way to the other side. It's in us. We can't escape it.
So, I mean, it sounds pretty clear that you would suspect or suppose that we're going to carry this forward into, off-world, into our interplanetary adventures. But even first, I'd be curious to hear you wax a bit on the contemporary significance of this in light of the fact that we are, in some sense, as a species, standing there on the Iberian Peninsula, looking across this expanse, which we can call, global warming or the Anthropocene, or this period where we're having to take an extraordinary and unprecedented accountability for ourselves as a species. And it's completely, something that I hear people talk about again and again and again on this show and elsewhere, is how, like, the first lesson that we seem to be confronted with right now collectively is acceptance of the fact that there's no guarantee that we're going to make it through this. That there's that something about the existential insecurity of embarking on this journey, this rite of passage as humankind, is like, well, there's a very strong chance that we're going to die in this process. And I'm curious, that seems like fairly low-hanging fruit if we transpose this archetypal structure onto our current condition. I'm curious to know.
Good question. Okay.
Yeah. So where else do you take it? Yeah.
I've got some good news for you. Some of us are going to make it. Okay. So I'm going to tell you, we're going to dial this back to 34,000 years ago, and 34,000 years ago we're entering the ice age at let's call it a higher point. So 17,000 years ago, there's glaciers across northern Europe. But Africa had wet periods, okay? And about 12,000 years ago, we have a great wet period in Africa because the climate had changed because of the wobble of the earth, which not precession of the equinoxes per se, but the wobble of the earth, precession itself. Okay, 12,000 years ago, cave art ends in Europe. It just ends. So all these phenomenal galleries and all these great animals, it just ends. But then it starts again in another place, in the Sahara. Okay, and in the Sahara at that time, we find images of giraffes and elephants and lions and alligators and hippopotamus. Fundamentally the same animals we saw in this European cave. Well, what happened was, through climate change, as we started to warm up, the monsoon range changed in Africa, that they moved north, and the Sahara became something like the Kalahari today, except a lot more lakes. So huge lakes. And so today you could travel for weeks on foot across the Sahara and come to a rock face and find a crocodile or a hippopotamus. Well, there was a time when there were lakes larger than the Great Lakes, and those lakes have since subsided into the earth, and they're pumping those out to feed water to the cities. Well, so what I believe happened is that 12,000 years ago, the people left Africa, went into Western North Africa, and they enjoyed, this abundance of animal life. So there will always be winners and there'll be losers. If there's warming in the United States, well, that means that it's going to be a little warmer in Alaska, and that'll change that environment too. And I'm not going to take one side or the other on this one, but there's going to be winners and losers. And in 4,000 years from now, the Sahara is going to be a wetland again. So that's a real estate tip. Get on it quick. But the world it's going to change, and people will be moving around, and the people that do move around are the ones that are going to make it. But the ones that stay where they are, and be domicile, their time will end. So we will always have migrations. We have governments now, we have people, and we've invested in homes and all these sort of things, but we will always migrate. And the people that migrate will be the ones that survive. And we can't turn back. There's man-influenced climate change. But there's also natural influence climate change due to the wobbling of the earth, and it relates to the angle of the sun. It's angled to the sun. So we will have a very different world in a few thousand years, where the Sahara is, where there's lakes with crocodiles swimming around again, and hippopotamus and giraffes running amok. And it'll be a beautiful place, a paradise of sorts. So there's going to be winners and losers. The good news is some of us are going to make it. And
you think that, it sounds like you're saying that it's almost like a Taoist statement about being flexible rather than being rigid in our orientation to a changing world. To call again on John David Ebert's talk from last night, afterwards in group discussion, we're talking about the future of the city and global warming and how, the enormous displacement of human populations is going to happen as the coastal cities are submerged.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see any, in a more, I guess, granular sense, do you see any kind of wisdom from this ancient human spiritual orientation and
absolutely
to what are the strategies beyond simply be prepared to pick up and go,
yeah. So a few strategies. So we can track this religion or this faith of sorts, this animist faith, from 34,000 years ago intact to 17,000 years ago at Lascaux Cave. So fundamentally no changes. So how could you have? Can Abrahamic religions haven't been around for more than 3,000, 4,000 years now, and there's so many splits between them that they're constantly at war. Well, these people had at least 17,000 years, and I would even say when it went into the Sahara after that, they had an intact religion and a cultural life perspective. And how they did it was they understood the world they were in with. They didn't treat the animals as animals that we should be afraid of or animals that we should just harvest, but they treated them as animals that we can learn from. So how does a rat survive in the city? Well, you can learn from that. I don't really need to know that today, but there's lots of lessons that we can learn from the animals about how they live in the world, in both the construction world we create as well as the natural world. And so this hero on his journey, he's learning how the world works. And he's bringing back that knowledge to his own people so they can carry on. And they carried on for at least 17,000 years with this knowledge. And that's phenomenal. So they went through the Ice Age. They went into the humid period in the North Sahara. The lesson to be learned about this, number one, we haven't changed in 34,000 years. And we're not going to change. Psychologically, we're not going to change. We're just going to have better toys. Number two is that if we can become more in tune to the animals in our world and respect that they're animal beings, not just wild animals, we can learn from them. And Native Americans will talk about how they brought the wolves back because the wolves teach them family relationships. And it's a brilliant metaphor or allegory that they use in their stories. Well, we can learn the same from all the animals in our world. How those animals not just persevere, but how they flourished in the environments that they live in, and what can we learn from them? And of course, over consumption, a penguin doesn't eat any more than it needs to. Because if it ate more than it needs to, you'd probably run out of fish for the penguin that's standing next to it in the cold. So there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the animals. Now, the animals in this image, the mothers nurture their young, they protect their young. And so we can learn that the importance of the females in society, which we, of course, have come to in our modern times, irrespective of these images. But we can also learn that we all seek to take this hero's journey, that the hero's journey is within ourselves. And if we someday don't have television, movie theaters, and Netflix and all these sort of things, we'll still tell the same story that we were told 34,000 years ago. We may change the name to Luke Skywalker or Frodo or Dorothy or whatever name we come up with, but we have these stories in us, and it's how we express where we come from and where we're going. And I don't just mean where we come from 34,000 years ago, but the stories express the unexplainable of existence before our existence, and perhaps an existence after our existence, or after the individual's existence at least. So these archetypal stories are in us. We can't escape from them. And once we recognize that, we can come to live in our own world and our own minds. And I believe that's the lesson to be learned from these images. We really haven't changed much, except we've got better toys.
It's funny. I think so often I hear when people talk about the hero's journey, it's like going to the gym or something. It's just this, this masculine, pumping up of, like you're testing yourself through trials. And there sounds like there's something in there here, but I love that your emphasis is on the humility and the receptivity to learning from the non-human intelligences. And it does seem, given our current scientific climate and the growing acceptance that we can talk about things like plant intelligence, for example, that we may be coming around to understanding linguistic communication of whales and dolphins and tool use and corvids and all that stuff, that it's kind of optimistic or hopeful that we do seem as a species to be, slowly pivoting back into this place of accepting that that the world does actually have something to teach us. So I'm curious. We're coming up on an hour here, and
you're curious about a lot of things, Michael. We're going to need to do another session.
I know. Yeah, this truly. Well, I mean, maybe the right place to put a pin in it for future conversation is, well, what is the current state of this research? You've got this book. You're making the rounds. You're telling people about it. Who else is working on these ideas? Where is this accepted? Where is this being challenged? What is the state of the larger conversation around your interpretations and ideas?
So for the archaeological side, it's been widely accepted across people who do these sort of things, and they're making connections between the animals. I do a lot of work on Picasso and how he found the images, and so there's a process between when people first identify things and they start their own research and timing and dating and so on. So you're probably talking 2 years before you start seeing people publishing new work on it or additional work in the literature, because I just disrupted the whole apple cart. Okay? People were on a path of working down a road with hypotheses, and I've come out of left field with something different. And so people are now working on dating work. They're studying the images and so forth. So that's sort of the archaeology and the anthropology. But this is the teacher's edition book of humanity. It tells us where we've come in 34,000 years, and perhaps even long before that. So there's so much to digest. And so the psychologists, they've got to rethink their own hypotheses about humanity and where we've come. Literature, we're telling the same story over and over again. In art, we're actually repainting the same pictures. Picasso borrowed images directly from these Paleolithic caves. And so modern art isn't even modern art, it's a recreation of Paleolithic art. And so there's a process that people are going through to say, oh my God, what are the implications of this? And you also have a lot of people that are published in these areas that it's going to take time for them to sort of kind of get over it and move on. But there's a lot of, I can look at the views on, YouTube and other places. I've reached more than 2 million people in long form podcasts, which means at least an hour. I could have done that 10 years ago, or 15, definitely not 15 years ago. And so the next step, what's the next step for me? I'm not writing another book, because this book was my hero's journey. I got past the red discs. I dove deep into myself. This was my story. And someday when you have a chance to read the whole book, you'll see that it truly was a journey. And so the next step for me is I'd love to do a documentary, something on Netflix, or be a part of a piece of somebody else's documentary, so Myths and Monsters or something like that, and build from there. And to keep telling this story. But I can see who retweets my stuff, and it's kind of a who's who in the people who think about these things. So there's a lot of excitement, a lot of interest. It's been fun. It's been excited. And if you read Joseph Campbell and his hero's journey, Hero of a Thousand Faces, one of the characteristics or points for the hero is that after he takes the journey, or he or she takes a journey, the hero returns home to tell the story of their journey, of their heroic epic. And so this is my time to tell the story and fundamentally kind of retire from the research and all these other things. But it's a lot of fun, and I love connecting and expressing and sharing the information that I gathered on this journey, and that many other people helped me as well, such as George Gamow.
So, I love to end these episodes with a little thought experiment, because if we're treating this as its own kind of cave painting, right, a communication to the distant future, to whatever archaeologist finds this episode recorded in a diamond like in the desert somewhere. I mean, that's my hope, is to get future fossils inscribed in diamond someday. Then, then you're going to be the blue ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi, passing your message down to them. And what would you, other than what you have said, other than this, profound synthesis of, the human mythosphere, what would you say, or what would you ask of these very, very distant future people?
Well, Michael, I believe that some great descendant of mine and some great descendant of yours will have the same conversation. Just as the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, Babylonians, and others had. And the question is going to be asked, what have we learned? And it will be the same answer that Picasso expressed when he came out of the Altamira cave. When people tasked him, is this real? Because they thought it was a fraud because it was too good. And Picasso walked out of the cave and he said one line, "We have invented nothing."
That's a beautiful place to wrap it up. Bernie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Great, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. This show is sponsored in part by featured patron Mike Schwab of knowyourmeme.com. Know Your Meme is a community where people expound on the history and significance of various web memes. It's super comprehensive. I think as far as navigating the increasingly deep layers of modern internet culture, Know Your Meme is providing a very vital function in helping us orient ourselves in what Michelle Shevin in episode 103, citing W.J.T. Mitchell, calls a paleontology of the present. I find Know Your Meme to be a very interesting and valuable resource. You can get into those forums and start contributing today. Also, this show is hosted on MindPod Network. Big shout out to Noah Lampert and everyone else on MindPod for their awesomeness. Subscribe to every podcast on there, then just lie on the floor having your mind blown constantly. Thanks everybody, and have a beautiful week.